The JonBenét Ramsey case shocked the world in 1996. A 6-year-old beauty pageant princess found dead in her family's basement on Christmas night. A bizarre ransom note, a family thrust into the spotlight under a cloud of suspicion. But decades later, whispers of a new perspective are emerging. Some analysts suggest a previously dismissed detail might hold the key. Investigators are reportedly revisiting leads that many thought were closed forever. Yet as we look closer, the contradictions start to surface. Evidence that was overlooked, behaviors that seemed out of place, questions that were never fully answered. What if everything we thought we knew about this case was only half the story? If the police missed this one critical piece, what else didn't add up? This case isn't just unsolved, it's psychologically disturbing in ways that make your skin crawl. The kind of mystery where nothing feels right no matter how many times you examine the facts. And now, with recent discussions highlighting an old name once more, the door to new theories has cracked open once again. But that was only the beginning of the revelations investigators are now confronting. In the quiet suburbs of Boulder, Colorado, on the morning of December 26, 1996, a family's worst nightmare became national headlines. 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey was found murdered in the basement of her own home. A single blow to the head, strangulation with a garrote fashioned from household items, and a bizarre 2.5-page ransom note left on the staircase. The investigation that followed was plagued with missteps almost from the start. Contaminated crime scenes, botched interviews, evidence that seemed to vanish into thin air. The family themselves quickly fell under intense scrutiny, yet no arrests, no charges, decades of silence from law enforcement. So why, after nearly 30 years of dormancy, are we suddenly hearing whispers of renewed focus on an old lead? Recent discussions and renewed analysis have quietly brought a previously dismissed detail back into the spotlight. Investigators have not confirmed any new suspect, not officially, but some experts now believe this could open an entirely fresh perspective on a case that has haunted the public for generations. Forensic analysts who have revisited the files point to inconsistencies that never quite added up. At first, they seemed like simple oversights: a flashlight left in the wrong place, a broken basement window that didn't match the story, footprints in the snow that didn't belong to the family. But investigators later realized these small details carried far more weight than anyone wanted to admit. Nothing in this case feels right. The cinematic narration, escalating stakes. The ransom note itself remains one of the most disturbing elements, written on paper from inside the house, demanding $118,000, an oddly specific amount that matched a recent bonus received by John Ramsey. Tone darkens. Behavioral experts have long debated whether the note was staged to look like an intruder crime or whether it pointed somewhere far more intimate. Some criminal profilers suggest the language reveals someone familiar with the family, someone who knew their routines, their finances, their secrets. Yet that intruder theory was pushed aside early on. Why? And why has it taken decades for certain leads to resurface? According to recent discussions among independent analysts and former investigators, one old name has quietly re-emerged in private conversations. Emphasis on possibility. This perspective was largely ignored in the original rush to judgment. This is not an official confirmation. It remains a theory based on available information. But if even a fraction of it holds truth, it suggests the killer may have slipped through the cracks not because of a brilliant cover-up, but because the investigation itself was flawed from the beginning. What kind of mind could orchestrate such a scene? a perpetrator who left behind DNA that still hasn't been fully matched, a crime scene that looked both professional and deeply personal. Behavioral experts who have studied the case for years describe a possible offender driven by a toxic mix of rage and control, someone who needed the family to suffer publicly, someone who understood exactly how to make the evidence point in conflicting directions. And now, with media attention intensifying once again, the public is left asking the same haunting question that has lingered since 1996. If the police missed this one critical lead all those years ago, what else didn't add up? What other contradictions were buried beneath the noise of tabloid headlines and family suspicion? The silence has finally been broken, but the answers still feel agonizingly outreach. Every new discussion only deepens the mystery. Every revisited detail makes the original investigation look more fragile, more human, more fallible. This case isn't just cold, it's psychologically disturbing in its refusal to make sense. And as fresh eyes examine leads once thought closed forever, the frustration grows, the tension tightens, because if investigators are now willing to reconsider what they once dismissed, it forces us all to confront an uncomfortable truth. The real story of what happened to JonBenét Ramsey may have been hiding in plain sight the entire time. What they discover next could rewrite everything we thought we understood about this tragedy. But for now, the silence is broken, and the questions remain louder than ever. In the affluent foothills of Boulder, Colorado, in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, stood a sprawling 15-room mansion that looked like it belonged on the cover of a lifestyle magazine. This was the home of the Ramsey family. John Ramsey, a successful businessman and CEO of a thriving computer company. Patsy Ramsey, a former beauty queen turned devoted mother. Their 9-year-old son, Burke, and at the center of it all, their youngest child, 6-year-old JonBenét Patricia Ramsey. JonBenét was a bright-eyed, charismatic little girl with a smile that could light up a room. She loved dancing, singing, and performing. By the time she was 5, she had already competed in more than a dozen child beauty pageants across Colorado and beyond. Sparkling tiaras, elaborate costumes, and stage makeup became part of her everyday world. Friends and neighbors described her as outgoing, affectionate, and full of energy. She was the kind of child who seemed destined for something special. Or so it appeared. Boulder itself was the picture of suburban safety, a quiet university town known for its progressive values, scenic trails, and tight-knit community. Crime was rare. Doors were often left unlocked. Families like the Ramseys represented the very best of American success. Wealthy, attractive, socially active. They hosted parties, attended church, and lived what looked like a flawless life. Yet even in this seemingly perfect setting, small contradictions began to surface once investigators started digging deeper. The intense focus on pageants for such a young child, the pressure to perform, the family's high public profile in a town that valued privacy. At first, these details seemed insignificant, but later, forensic analysts and behavioral experts would revisit them with fresh eyes. How did a life that looked so carefully constructed suddenly become the center of one of America's most disturbing mysteries? Some behavioral experts who have studied the case over the years suggest the pageant world itself created a unique kind of pressure. A 6-year-old girl taught to smile through discomfort, to project perfection no matter what. The contrast between her sparkling public image and the private reality inside that mansion raised quiet questions. Neighbors later recalled hearing arguments behind closed doors. Friends mentioned Patsy's fierce drive to make JonBenét a star. Unexpected behaviors that, in hindsight, painted a more complicated picture than the glossy family photos suggested. The Ramsey home itself was a labyrinth of rooms and hidden spaces, a basement that few outsiders ever saw,
a broken window that had gone unrepaired for months. At first, these things blended into the background of everyday life, but investigators later realized these small details would become crucial pieces in a puzzle that refused to fit together neatly. Why would a family living in such apparent safety ignore warning signs that now seem so obvious? Nothing in this story feels right when you step back and look at the full picture. A child who spent her days performing for judges suddenly silenced forever. A family that projected perfection now under the harsh glare of national scrutiny. The quiet streets of Boulder transformed overnight into a media circus. Reporters camped outside, cameras rolling 24/7. The American dream, it seemed, had a dark underbelly no one wanted to acknowledge. Criminal profilers who have examined the case over the years suggest a possible environment where image mattered above all else, where vulnerability could be hidden behind smiles and sequins, where a child's schedule left little room for normal childhood. Some experts believe this kind of controlled, high-pressure upbringing can create invisible cracks in even the strongest families, cracks that outsiders rarely notice until it's too late. And yet, the real tragedy was still hours away on that cold December night in 1996. Everything was about to shatter. The more you examine JonBenét's short life, the more the contradictions pile up. The perfect family, the perfect town, the perfect child. All of it now stained by questions that have lingered for nearly 30 decades. Ignored evidence, overlooked behaviors, details that simply did not add up. According to some independent analysts who have revisited the original files, this backdrop of apparent perfection may have actually worked against the investigation from the very beginning. A theory based on available information suggests the family's polished image may have blinded early responders to inconsistencies that were hiding in plain sight. This is not an official conclusion. It remains one possible perspective among many. If the police missed these early warning signs in such a high-profile family, what else didn't add up? What other pieces of the puzzle were set aside in those critical first hours? The girl in Boulder had lived a life that millions of children could only dream about, but that dream became a nightmare that still haunts investigators, experts, and the public to this day. The contrast between her sparkling world and the horror that followed creates a psychological unease that refuses to fade. Because in this case, the more you learn about the victim, the less anything feels right, and the silence that followed her death would only grow louder with every unanswered question.
December 25th, 1996, began like any other Christmas in the affluent Ramsey household in Boulder, Colorado. The family had spent the evening at a holiday dinner with close friends. They returned home around 9:30 that night. Everything appeared perfectly normal. John Ramsey carried his sleeping 6-year-old daughter JonBenét upstairs and tucked her into bed. Patsy and their 9-year-old son Burke followed soon after. The house grew quiet. The lights went out. And by all accounts, the family settled in for what should have been a peaceful night. But something happened inside those walls during the next 8 hours. Something that would shatter that perfect Christmas illusion forever. No one heard a thing. According to police logs and the family's own statements, Patsy Ramsey woke shortly before 5:30 the next morning. She came downstairs and discovered a 2.5-page handwritten ransom note on the staircase. It was addressed to John. It claimed JonBenét had been kidnapped. It demanded exactly $118,000. The note warned against calling the police. Yet Patsy dialed 911 at 5:52 a.m., her voice frantic on the recording. Her daughter was missing. The house was searched. Police arrived within minutes. Friends and family began gathering for support. At first, it seemed like a straightforward kidnapping case, but forensic analysts later determined the note had been written on paper torn from a pad found inside the Ramsey kitchen, using a pen also from the house. a small detail that would become crucial. So what exactly happened inside that house during those missing hours between bedtime on Christmas night and the discovery of that ransom note? Behavioral experts who have studied the timeline describe those silent overnight hours as one of the most psychologically disturbing aspects of the entire case. A 6-year-old child vanishes from her bedroom without a single scream loud enough to wake her family. No forced entry that investigators could immediately confirm. No signs of struggle that carried through the house. The kind of quiet that simply doesn't add up in a home invasion scenario. Some criminal profilers suggest this points to someone who knew the layout intimately, someone who moved with purpose and without panic. At first, the ransom note appeared to support an intruder theory, but investigators soon discovered something that made the case even more disturbing. The oddly specific amount demanded matched John Ramsey's recent bonus check almost to the dollar, a coincidence that raised immediate red flags. The language in the note mixed movie-like phrasing with personal details only someone close to the family would know. Forensic handwriting analysts would later spend years debating its authorship. Yet those early morning hours remain murky. Police logs show the initial response focused on waiting for a ransom call that never came. Why did no one in the house wake up? Why were there no audible signs of distress from a child known for her energy and spirit? By 6 a.m., the Boulder Police Department had officers on scene, but the house was not immediately treated as a full crime scene. Friends walked through rooms, items were moved. The basement was only partially searched in those first hours. A broken window in the basement, long unrepaired, was noted but not fully examined right away. Footprints and other trace evidence would later be identified, but in the critical early window, much of it was overlooked or contaminated. Nothing in those hours feels right. Forensic reconstruction, based on rigor mortis and other medical indicators, later placed JonBenét's time of death sometime between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m., that narrow window of darkness when the entire family claimed to be asleep upstairs. According to investigators, the crime scene suggested both a violent struggle and a carefully staged presentation. Duct tape over the mouth, a garrote fashioned from cord and a paintbrush handle found in the house, hands loosely bound, a white blanket draped over the body. Details that appeared both rushed and disturbingly intimate. Some behavioral experts believe the staging itself reveals a perpetrator driven by a need for control, someone who needed the family to suffer publicly, someone who understood exactly how to create confusion. The unexpected calm in the household that morning, the way the note was placed in plain sight, the way the body was hidden yet accessible in a room the first officer had actually passed by. These behaviors paint a picture of calculated psychological manipulation. And yet the most haunting question still lingers. If the police missed these early inconsistencies in those first critical hours, what else didn't add up? What other contradictions were buried in the chaos of that Christmas night turning into a nightmare? The timeline of December 25th into the 26th remains one of the most scrutinized yet unresolved chapters in the entire investigation. A seemingly perfect holiday evening, a quiet return home, hours of unexplained silence, then a ransom note that defied logic from the start. Every new forensic review only deepens the mystery. Every revisited police log highlights the gaps, the contradictions, the unexpected behaviors that simply refuse to align. According to some independent analysts who have re-examined the original files, these missing hours may hold the key to understanding how an intruder theory was both embraced and ultimately questioned. This is not an official conclusion. It remains a theory based on available information. But if even part of the reconstruction holds true, it suggests the events of that night unfolded in a way that the initial investigation was never fully equipped to unravel. The girl who went to bed on Christmas night never woke up, and the family that should have protected her woke up to a house that no longer felt like home.
The silence of those overnight hours still echoes louder than any scream ever could. Because in this case, the more you examine what happened on the night of December 25th, the less anything feels right. And what investigators would discover in the basement later that afternoon would only make those missing hours feel more impossible to explain.
Among the most shocking pieces of evidence in the JonBenét Ramsey case was a single document that defied every expectation of a typical ransom demand. On the morning of December 26, 1996, Patsy Ramsey discovered a 2.5-page handwritten note on the staircase of her Boulder home. It was addressed directly to her husband, John. It claimed their daughter had been kidnapped by a small foreign faction, and it demanded exactly $118,000 for her safe return. The note had been written inside the house, on paper torn from a legal pad belonging to the Ramseys, using a Sharpie pen found in the kitchen. At first, it seemed like proof of an intruder, but forensic analysts later determined something that made the case even more disturbing. The oddly specific amount matched John Ramsey's recent bonus check almost to the dollar, information not publicly known at the time. The language mixed awkward phrasing with movie-style threats, references to beheading, instructions that read like a script rather than a real kidnapper's demand. No fingerprints, no usable DNA recovered from the pages themselves. A document that should have been straightforward instead became a labyrinth of contradictions. Why would a genuine kidnapper write such a lengthy note inside the victim's home using the family's own supplies? And why did the evidence seem to point in multiple conflicting directions at once? Psychological experts who have studied the ransom note describe it as one of the most psychologically revealing elements of the entire investigation. Some criminal profilers suggest the author displayed a need for control mixed with theatrical flair, the kind of mind that wanted the family to panic publicly while hiding the truth in plain sight. The note's placement, its precise wording, its failure to deliver any follow-up call, all of it created a fog of misdirection that investigators struggled to penetrate. Then there was the DNA. Trace amounts of unidentified male DNA found on JonBenét's underwear and long johns, touch DNA consistent with a single unknown contributor. At first, this seemed like the breakthrough that could crack the case wide open. Forensic analysts confirmed it did not match any family member, it did not match known associates, it pointed toward an outsider. But that same DNA has never been fully identified despite decades of testing and database searches, a ghost profile that still haunts the files. So how did foreign DNA end up on a 6-year-old girl in her own home if the crime was staged? Or was the staging itself designed to confuse exactly this kind of evidence? The crime scene itself only deepened the chaos. JonBenét's body was discovered in a small basement wine cellar later that afternoon, covered by a white blanket, duct tape over her mouth, a garrote fashioned from cord and a broken paintbrush handle taken from inside the house. Her hands loosely bound with the same type of cord, a small flashlight left nearby. Footprints and other trace evidence that didn't perfectly align with any single narrative. At first, these details appeared random, but investigators later realized they suggested both violence and deliberate presentation, a scene that looked simultaneously rushed and carefully arranged. Nothing in this evidence feels right. Forensic reconstruction showed the anomalies piled up quickly, a broken basement window that had gone unrepaired for months, yet no glass disturbance consistent with a forced entry by an outsider. Pineapple found in JonBenét's stomach that the family said they hadn't served that night. Small details that should have been minor, but instead created massive cracks in every theory. The Boulder Police Department faced conflicting leads from the very beginning. Intruder evidence versus signs of staging, insider knowledge versus unknown DNA. Every new forensic review only highlighted how the evidence refused to line up neatly. Some behavioral experts believe this conflicting forensic picture points to a perpetrator who thrived on misdirection,
Someone who understood police procedure enough to plant red herrings. Someone driven by rage but disciplined enough to create a scene that would keep investigators chasing shadows for decades. The kind of psychological profile that leaves you wondering whether the crime was personal, opportunistic, or something far more calculated. If the police missed these early forensic contradictions in those critical first hours, what else didn't add up? What other pieces of evidence were overlooked or misinterpreted while the trail was still fresh? According to some independent analysts who have re-examined the original forensic files in recent discussions, these elements may have been designed to pull the investigation in opposite directions from the start. This is not an official conclusion. It remains a theory based on available information. But if even part of that perspective holds true, it suggests the evidence itself became part of the psychological game being played. The evidence that shocked investigators wasn't just confusing, it was deliberately layered in ways that still create frustration and unease today. A ransom note that pointed inward, DNA that pointed outward, a crime scene that pointed everywhere and nowhere at once. And as fresh eyes revisit these same forensic details decades later, the contradictions only grow louder. Because in this case, the more you examine the evidence that shocked investigators, the less anything feels right. And the answers that should have been clear from the beginning remain buried beneath layers of doubt that refuse to fade.
In the critical first hours after JonBenét Ramsey was reported missing on December 26, 1996, the Boulder Police Department responded to what they believed was a kidnapping in progress. Officers arrived at the Ramsey home within minutes of Patsy Ramsey's 911 call. The family was already surrounded by friends who had come to offer support, and the sprawling 15-room mansion quickly filled with people moving through rooms that had not yet been secured. At first, it seemed like standard procedure for a missing child case, but investigators soon discovered something that made the case even more disturbing. Critical clues were being left behind or overlooked almost immediately. Forensic samples that should have been collected and preserved right away were delayed for weeks or even months in some instances. The crime scene itself was never fully secured in those early moments. Friends and family members walked freely through the house. Items were touched and moved. The basement, where JonBenét would later be found, was only partially checked in the initial search. A broken window and other potential points of entry were noted, but not thoroughly documented or protected. Reports from within the investigation later acknowledged that early assumptions about the nature of the crime may have biased the entire approach. Why were certain forensic items not rushed for immediate testing? Why were obvious leads allowed to grow cold while the trail was still fresh? Did critical errors early on permanently derail the truth? Behavioral experts and former investigators who have reviewed the case files describe these early missteps as more than simple oversights. Some criminal profilers suggest the initial focus on a stranger kidnapping created a tunnel vision that made it difficult to see other possibilities clearly. The unexpected calm in the household that morning, the way certain evidence was handled without proper chain of custody protocols. These behaviors point to a kind of institutional hesitation, a reluctance to treat the scene as a homicide until the body was actually discovered later that afternoon. That shift in mindset, experts believe, may have allowed subtle but vital clues to slip through the cracks. At first, many of these details seemed minor. A flashlight left in an unusual place. Trace evidence on the stairs that was never fully pursued. Opportunities to interview family members more aggressively in those first critical hours. But forensic analysts later realized these small lapses would become crucial roadblocks in building a clear picture. Some important leads that could have helped confirm or eliminate persons of interest were simply not followed up with the urgency the situation demanded. How many potential answers were lost in those chaotic early moments when the house was still treated like the site of a possible ransom drop rather than the site of a murder? The investigation faced mounting pressure as media attention exploded overnight. Boulder, a quiet university town, suddenly found itself at the center of a national spectacle.
Internal reports suggest disagreements among detectives about the direction of the case created further delays. Some forensic samples sat untested for extended periods, while other leads were prioritized based on early theories rather than hard evidence. The result was a series of missed opportunities that still frustrate those who have studied the files decades later. Nothing in this investigation feels right. The clues left behind were not hidden in some elaborate conspiracy. They were right there in plain sight. Contaminated evidence, delayed testing, assumptions that shaped the questions asked and the ones that were never asked at all. Former officials involved in the case have openly acknowledged that if they could go back, the initial response would look very different. That admission only deepens the psychological unease surrounding the entire probe. A case where the very system designed to uncover truth may have unintentionally buried parts of it. Some behavioral experts believe these investigative shortcomings reflect a deeper human element. Investigators, like anyone else, can be influenced by the polished image of a family, the high-profile setting, the shock of a child vanishing from what appeared to be a safe home. That psychological bias, experts suggest, can lead even seasoned professionals to overlook inconsistencies that now seem glaring in hindsight. The kind of blind spot that turns a promising lead into a permanent dead end. If the police missed these early clues and mishandled these critical opportunities, what else didn't add up? What other contradictions were allowed to fade while the focus shifted elsewhere? According to some independent analysts who have re-examined the original case files in recent discussions, these overlooked elements may have created a ripple effect that affected every theory that followed. This is not an official conclusion. It remains a theory based on available information. But even if a portion of that perspective holds true, it suggests the truth may have been within reach in those first hours, if only the right questions had been asked and the right evidence preserved. The clues left behind were not just physical traces on a crime scene. They were the silent witnesses to an investigation that began unraveling almost as soon as it started. Every delayed sample, every ignored inconsistency, every assumption that went unchallenged, all of it contributing to a mystery that refuses to resolve. And as new discussions quietly bring old leads back into focus decades later, the frustration only grows sharper. Because in this case, the more you examine the clues that were left behind, the less anything feels right. And the haunting possibility remains that the answers investigators needed most may have been lost in those very first fateful hours.
For nearly 29 years, the JonBenét Ramsey investigation has examined dozens of persons of interest. Some were cleared quickly, others lingered in the files, only to fade as new leads emerged. The Boulder Police Department has consistently stated that no one has ever been formally charged. The case remains open and active. Yet recent discussions among analysts and investigative journalists have quietly brought an old name back into focus, a name that many thought had been set aside forever. With modern forensic tools now available, certain overlooked details from the original evidence are being re-examined in a fresh light. Reports suggest that advanced DNA retesting and renewed interviews have prompted some experts to take another look at a previously considered individual. At first, these connections seemed too distant to matter, but investigators and independent analysts later realized that small inconsistencies once dismissed could carry far more weight when viewed through today's technology. Why would authorities suddenly reconsider someone who had been looked at and largely set aside years earlier? What changed that made this particular lead feel relevant again after so much time? Behavioral experts who have studied the case over the years describe this kind of quiet reevaluation as psychologically telling. Some criminal profilers suggest that the original investigation may have moved too quickly past certain individuals because the evidence appeared contradictory at the time. The polished family image,
the high-profile media pressure, the rush to pursue the most obvious intruder theory, all of it may have created blind spots. Now, with clearer forensic perspectives, those same details are raising new questions about whether a person once considered peripheral might actually fit the profile in ways that were not fully appreciated before. Forensic analysts note that trace evidence and behavioral patterns that once seemed insignificant are now being recontextualized. A theory based on available information suggests these elements could point towards someone who had potential access, someone whose movements or background were never completely ruled out. This is not an official conclusion from the Boulder Police Department. It remains one possible perspective among many. Yet the mere fact that this name has resurfaced at all forces a deeper unease. If modern analysis can revive a lead once thought closed, how many other possibilities were overlooked in those critical early years? The psychological weight of the case grows heavier with every new discussion. A quiet neighborhood, a seemingly perfect family, a crime scene filled with anomalies that still refuse to align neatly, and now a name that refuses to stay buried. Independent analysts caution that these observations are exactly that, observations, not proof, not charges, but the renewed scrutiny alone highlights how fragile the original conclusions may have been. Nothing in this development feels settled. The clues that once pointed in conflicting directions are now being filtered through 21st century science. New interviews, retested samples, fresh eyes on old files. Every step deepens the sense that the investigation may have missed something vital, not because the evidence was hidden, but because the right lens had not yet been applied. Some behavioral experts believe this pattern itself reveals a perpetrator who understood how to exploit confusion, someone whose actions created enough doubt to keep the truth suspended for decades. If the police missed these connections the first time around, what else didn't add up? What other contradictions were quietly set aside while the focus shifted elsewhere? According to some analysts who have followed the renewed discussions closely, this re-emerging name may represent a perspective that was largely ignored in the original rush to judgment. This is not an official confirmation. It is a theory based strictly on available information. But if even a fraction of these observations holds merit, it suggests the killer may never have truly left the radar. They may have simply been overlooked in the noise of a case that refused to make sense from the beginning. The emergence of this renewed focus creates a psychological tension that is hard to shake. A case that has haunted the public for almost 30 years suddenly feels closer to resolution, yet more disturbing than ever. Every revisited detail only underscores the same haunting truth. The more we learn about what investigators are quietly reconsidering, the less anything in this case feels right. And the silence that has surrounded JonBenét Ramsey's death for so long might finally be giving way to questions that demand answers, once and for all.
The crime scene inside the Ramsey home on December 26, 1996, revealed behaviors that went far beyond simple violence. JonBenét's body was found in a small basement room. Duct tape covered her mouth. A garrote made from cord and a paintbrush handle taken from inside the house was tightened around her neck. Her hands were loosely bound. A white blanket was carefully draped over her. The scene showed both brutality and a disturbing level of presentation. At first, these details appeared chaotic, but behavioral experts who have studied the case for decades describe something far more calculated. Someone had staged this. The garrote, the binding, the blanket, the precise placement of the body in a room the first officer had actually walked past earlier that morning.
Forensic analysts later determined these elements suggested a perpetrator who took time to arrange the scene after the act, someone who understood exactly how to create maximum confusion, the kind of staging that required familiarity with the house layout, the family's routines, and even small household items. Why go to such elaborate lengths if the goal was simply to kill and escape? Does the behavior suggest an insider or someone carefully pretending to be one? Criminal profilers and behavioral experts who have reviewed the files point to clear signs of control and premeditation. The use of items found inside the house, the absence of forced entry that matched the level of violence, the ransom note written on the family's own paper with language that blended personal knowledge and theatrical threats. Some behavioral experts believe this points to a mind driven by rage mixed with a deep need for dominance, a perpetrator who not only wanted to end a life but needed the family to suffer publicly, needed the world to watch, needed the investigation to spiral into decades of doubt. At first, the staging seemed amateurish, but investigators later realized it was sophisticated enough to keep two major theories alive at the same time: an intruder who somehow knew the house intimately, or someone inside the circle who made it look like an outsider. The psychological footprint left behind was unmistakable. This was not a random act. It carried the mark of someone who understood exactly how to exploit the chaos that would follow. How does a killer move through a sleeping household without waking anyone, then spend time staging a scene that would confuse professionals for 30 years? The contradictions pile up the deeper you look. A garrote that required practice to fashion, a note that demanded a specific amount only the family would recognize, behaviors that suggested both cold calculation and personal fury. Behavioral experts describe this as the hallmark of a perpetrator who thrived on misdirection, someone who may have rehearsed the psychological impact as much as the physical act itself. The unexpected calm after the crime, the way the evidence pointed in opposite directions simultaneously, all of it created a perfect storm of confusion that still haunts every new analysis. Nothing in this offender's mind feels random. Recent discussions among independent analysts have revisited these behavioral patterns with fresh eyes. The familiarity with the home, the control displayed in the staging, the premeditated elements that suggest the perpetrator knew the family's schedule and vulnerabilities. Some criminal profilers suggest this profile fits someone who had access, who understood the power of public spectacle, and who needed the truth to remain buried beneath layers of doubt. If the police missed these psychological red flags in the original investigation, what else didn't add up? What other signs of intent were overlooked while the focus stayed locked on surface-level theories? According to some behavioral experts who have followed the renewed analysis, these patterns may indicate a perpetrator who was far closer to the family than initially believed. This is not an official conclusion. It remains a theory based strictly on available information and psychological interpretation. But if even part of this perspective holds true, it suggests the crime was not just an act of violence. It was a carefully orchestrated psychological game designed to leave investigators chasing shadows indefinitely. The more you step inside the mind behind this crime, the more disturbing the contradictions become. A killer who left DNA yet staged the scene like an insider. Someone who killed in silence yet screamed for attention through every detail left behind. The psychological unease grows heavier with every revisited file. Because in this case, the behavior doesn't just point to a murderer, it points to someone who understood exactly how to make sure nothing would ever feel right again. And as new names quietly resurface in discussions, the question lingers louder than ever. What else didn't add up inside the mind that planned that night?
For nearly 30 years, the murder of 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey has stood as one of the most baffling cases in American true crime history. On December 26, 1996, in the upscale home of John and Patsy Ramsey in Boulder, Colorado, a ransom note was found demanding exactly $118,000. Hours later, the child's body was discovered in the basement, strangled with a garrote made from items inside the house itself. Every major theory crafted around this crime carries fatal flaws that simply refuse to align. Let's start with what investigators first believed. The intruder theory seemed solid at first glance. Unknown male DNA was found on JonBenét's clothing and beneath her fingernails. A broken basement window suggested forced entry. Some behavioral experts pointed to the garrote as the work of a sexual predator who had stalked the family. But investigators soon discovered something that made the entire scenario far more disturbing. No footprints led away from the house in the fresh snow. The ransom note had been written on a pad and with a pen taken from inside the Ramsey kitchen. Why would an intruder sit at the family's table, compose a 2.5-page letter, then leave the body downstairs instead of fleeing? That single detail alone begins to fracture the intruder narrative. Now consider the insider theory. The note's exact dollar amount matched John Ramsey's recent bonus. Handwriting experts were divided, yet some noted striking similarities to Patsy Ramsey's own writing. The family had not searched the entire house before calling 911. John Ramsey himself carried his daughter's body upstairs after finding her. Tense pause. According to forensic analysts, the scene showed signs of staging. The duct tape, the cord, the paintbrush handle. All household items. Behavioral experts have long profiled this as classic staging by someone desperate to redirect suspicion. Yet here is where the insider theory collapses under its own weight. The foreign DNA does not match any Ramsey family member. Polygraph results for both parents were inconclusive at best, and the grand jury's decision to indict them for child abuse leading to death was ultimately blocked by the district attorney. If the family did it, why leave DNA that points elsewhere? And if they didn't, why does every piece of physical evidence inside the house scream familiarity? Nothing fits. The contradictions keep piling up, layer after layer, until the frustration becomes almost unbearable. Media narratives swung wildly between the parents did it and a pedophile broke in. Public speculation exploded, yet every strong theory seems to shatter the moment you press on it. Forensic evidence supports an outsider until you examine the staging. Insider behavior explains the note and the lack of forced entry until you confront the unknown male DNA. If the police missed these glaring inconsistencies early on, what else didn't add up? What small detail was ignored in those first critical hours that might have changed everything? Some behavioral experts now suggest the killer operated with chilling intimacy. They knew the house layout. They knew the family's finances. They knew how to stage a scene that would paralyze investigators with doubt. Was this the work of a sophisticated predator who had been watching the family for months? Or was it someone closer, driven by a psychological fracture the public still cannot see? Either way, the case refuses to resolve. Every path investigators take leads straight into another dead end, another contradiction that leaves you questioning not just who did it, but how the truth could remain this perfectly obscured for nearly 30 decades. The intruder theory collapses under the weight of insider evidence. The insider theory collapses under the weight of physical evidence from an unknown source. Media frenzy, expert opinions, and public speculation have all diverged so sharply that the case now feels less like a puzzle and more like a psychological trap designed to keep everyone guessing. Why does every promising lead evaporate the moment you examine it closely? What are we still not seeing? The JonBenét Ramsey case is not simply unsolved, it is psychologically disturbing in its perfection of contradictions, and that is exactly why it continues to haunt us all.
If you're drawn to real investigative crime stories that expose the fractures no one wants to admit exist, consider subscribing for more deep-dive documentaries that refuse to settle for easy answers. Nearly 3 decades after that Christmas night in 1996, the JonBenét Ramsey case remains officially unsolved. No arrest, no conviction, no closure for a little girl whose murder shattered a quiet Boulder neighborhood and captivated the world. Mountains of evidence were collected, thousands of hours of investigation poured in, and yet the truth still feels just out of reach. Investigators have revisited every scrap of physical evidence more times than anyone can count. The ransom note, the unknown male DNA, the garrote fashioned from household items, the broken basement window that may or may not have been staged. At first glance, some pieces pointed clearly to an intruder, others screamed insider involvement. Forensic analysts later determined that critical early decisions may have compromised the scene itself. But investigators soon discovered something that made the entire investigation even more disturbing. Leads that once seemed promising were quietly set aside. Details that should have been pursued immediately were left to gather dust. Cinematic shift, gently but unmistakably shifts. In recent discussions among analysts and former investigators have now brought renewed attention to an old lead that was once pushed to the margins. Careful emphasis. A theory that suggests the killer may have been someone who slipped through the cracks of the original suspect list. Not officially confirmed, based entirely on available information and fresh reinterpretation of existing evidence. Some behavioral experts believe this perspective could explain the chilling intimacy of the crime scene, the precise knowledge of the family's finances, and the sophisticated staging that left seasoned detectives second-guessing themselves for years. Yet nothing is settled. What if the truth has been hiding in plain sight all along? If the police missed these overlooked connections early on, what else didn't add up? What small detail dismissed in those first chaotic hours might have pointed investigators in an entirely different direction? Behavioral experts have long profiled the offender as someone who operated with calculated calm, someone who knew the house layout intimately, who understood exactly how to create a scene that would paralyze the investigation with doubt. Was this the work of a sophisticated predator who had been watching the family for months? Or could it have been someone closer, driven by a psychological fracture that the public still cannot fully see? Either way, the case refuses to resolve. Every path leads straight into another dead end, another layer of human error, another unanswered question that deepens the psychological disturbance at the heart of this mystery. Decades of media frenzy, expert debates, and public speculation have only amplified the frustration. Theories rise, theories fall, and still no one has been held accountable. If the truth was someone the investigation once considered and then dismissed, why has the truth remained this perfectly obscured? What are we still not seeing after all these years? The JonBenét Ramsey case is not simply unsolved, it is psychologically disturbing in its perfection of contradictions, in the way it forces us to confront how easily evidence can be misinterpreted and how quickly certainty can dissolve into doubt. The questions linger long after the lights go out. Why does nothing in this case feel right? Why does every lead, no matter how strong, leave us more confused than before? If you're drawn to real investigative crime stories that expose the fractures no one wants to admit exist, consider subscribing for more deep-dive documentaries that refuse to settle for easy answers.